Hi, everyone. It's good to be here with you. Today, we're going to talk about emotional self-care under pressure, what it looks like when activation is already high and you don't have much margin. Before we go there, I want to take a few minutes to remind us what we've already built, because this topic only makes sense in the context of that foundation. Early on, we learned a different way of understanding emotions. Instead of treating emotions as problems to solve or signs that something is wrong, we treated them as information. Emotions are signals coming from the nervous system, shaped by learning, experience, and protection. That shift matters because it changes the relationship people have to what they feel. It moves emotions out of the category of something to get rid of and into the category of something to understand. From there, we spent time on awareness. That meant learning how to notice emotions, physical sensations, urges, and thoughts as they arise, rather than recognizing them only after a reaction has already taken over. We also talked about noticing how strong something feels, how quickly it escalates, and what it pulls your attention toward when the system is under stress. That awareness is not just noticing, it's timing. It's becoming aware early enough where you still have options. Then we added internal regulation. We talked about what happens in the nervous system as activation increases and what it looks like to stay present rather than immediately reacting or shutting down or distracting away from the experience. The focus wasn't on calming anything or making feelings disappear. It was on staying engaged long enough to see what the reaction is doing before it turns into behavior. That's a major shift because for many people, the automatic move is activation rises, urgency rises, behavior happens. Internal regulation interrupts that sequence. The last layer we worked with built directly on that internal capacity. Once awareness and regulation are available, we can begin to look at how emotional experience gets shaped over time, not just in the moment, but across days, interactions, and stress cycles. We focused on three closely related processes. Now we're ready to move into new material. Everything we just reviewed was about building internal capacity, changing how emotions are understood, learning to notice what's happening as it happens, staying present as activation increases, and understanding how interpretation, relationships, and self talk shape emotional experience over time. This next part of the work exists because people eventually encounter a very specific problem. They understand the concepts, they recognize what's happening internally, they know what supports regulation, and still, when activation is already high, those same skills can feel much harder to access. This isn't a contradiction and it isn't a failure of the work. It's a predictable effect of how the nervous system functions when stress activation is elevated and capacity is reduced. What we're focusing on here is emotional self care during high activation, when stress hormones are already elevated, when emotional intensity is stronger, and when there is less available bandwidth for reflection and choice. This is not about learning new foundational ideas. It's about understanding what happens to awareness, regulation, and behavior inside this state, and how to work with the nervous system as it is, rather than expecting it to function as if conditions were easier. That's the shift we're making here. Before we go any further into how to work with this state, it's important to understand what high activation actually does to the brain. When stress activation increases, the brain shifts its priorities. Systems designed to detect threat and seek relief become more active. These systems are fast, efficient, and oriented toward immediate action. At the same time, the parts of the brain involved in regulation, perspective, and flexible decision making have less influence. They don't disappear, but they have a harder time staying engaged when activation is already elevated. This shift is not a flaw in the system. It's a survival-oriented reorganization. The brain is doing what it was designed to do under stress: reduce uncertainty, move quickly, and prioritize familiar responses that have worked in the past. One important consequence of this shift is that urges and reactions can feel more convincing and more urgent than they otherwise would. Interpretation happens faster. Emotional certainty increases. The window for reflection and choice becomes smaller. This all happens before conscious decision making. The goal of emotional self-care here is not to eliminate activation or override the brain's protective response. It's to preserve enough regulatory presence for choice to remain possible, even briefly, while activation is high. That understanding is what everything else we talk about next is built on. Before we go any further, I want to be very clear about what mastery means in this context, because this is where people often develop unrealistic expectations about themselves. Mastery here does not mean that emotions disappear. It does not mean that urges stop showing up. It does not mean that stress or activation is gone. High activation can still be present. What changes is not intensity, it's what happens next. Under high activation, mastery means that behavior is no longer automatic. The nervous system still responds, emotions still arise, and urges can still be felt. But there's enough regulatory presence for choice to re-enter the system. The most important variable here is timing. When someone is able to stay present for even a few seconds longer while activation is rising, the entire sequence can change. That small window is often enough to interrupt the automatic move from activation to action. This isn't willpower. It's not forcing yourself to behave differently. It's not suppressing what you feel. It's the result of awareness and regulation remaining available long enough for a different response to become possible. That's what mastery looks like here. Not control, not perfection, but the ability to stay engaged with what's happening internally without being immediately driven by it. That distinction is essential for everything that comes next. Now we can talk more specifically about urges, because this is often where people feel the most confusion or frustration. When nervous system activation is high, urges tend to become stronger, louder, and even more convincing. That happens because the brain is prioritizing relief. It's scanning for whatever has reduced discomfort quickly in the past, and it brings those options forward with urgency. This doesn't mean the urge is telling you what you need. It means the system is distressed and it's looking for something familiar to relieve it. Under high activation, the brain relies more heavily on learned response patterns. These are pathways that have been reinforced over time because they once worked, at least temporarily. When those pathways activate, the urge can feel time sensitive and necessary, even when you know intellectually that it won't actually resolve what's happening. One of the most important shifts here is learning to recognize the urge accurately. An urge is not a directive, it is not a requirement. It is not the same thing as a need. It's a signal that the system is under strain and reaching for a familiar form of relief. When that distinction becomes clear, something subtle but important happens. The urgency softens just enough for awareness to stay present. The system has more room to pause, even briefly, and that pause is what allows choice to remain possible. This isn't about fighting urges or trying to make them go away. It's about understanding what they are, why they intensify under high activation, and how recognizing them accurately changes what happens next. This brings us to an important distinction that becomes especially relevant when activation is high. Urges and needs are not the same thing. An urge signals that the nervous system is under stress. It reflects distress and a push toward relief, but it doesn't tell you what will actually resolve that distress. Needs are different. Needs are the conditions that allow the nervous system to stabilize and recover. Things like rest, reassurance, connection, safety, or clearer boundaries address the underlying state directly. When activation is high, urges often feel like needs. That's because the brain is looking for immediate relief and bringing familiar options forward quickly. But familiar relief strategies tend to reduce discomfort briefly without resolving the underlying activation. The system may settle for a moment and then rebound, often with more intensity. Meeting needs directly works differently. It supports regulation at the level of the nervous system rather than just interrupting sensation. When needs are met, activation can settle more fully, and the urgency driving the urge diminishes over time. This distinction matters because it changes how you respond internally. Instead of treating an urge as something to obey or suppress, it becomes information. The system needs support. And that opens the door to responses that actually stabilize rather than prolong the cycle. Understanding this difference is a key part of staying engaged with yourself during high activation without being pulled into automatic behavior. Once we can tell the difference between urges and needs, the question becomes what it actually looks like to respond to needs when activation is high. Direct need meeting means responding at the level of the nervous system, not just at the level of sensation or impulse. For example, if the nervous system is exhausted, rest supports regulation in a way no quick relief strategy can. If the system is overwhelmed or uncertain, reassurance or clarity reduces activation more effectively than distraction. If the nervous system is isolated, connection changes the physiological state in ways that solitary coping can't. These responses may not produce the same immediate intensity of relief that familiar urge-based strategies do, but they work differently. They settle the system more fully and reduce the likelihood that activation will rebound. Over time, this matters a lot. When needs are met directly, the nervous system begins to learn that regulation is possible without relying on the same automatic responses. New pathways strengthen. Urges lose some of their authority because the system has experienced other forms of relief that actually work. This isn't about responding perfectly in the moment. It's about gradually shifting what the system learns is available when activation rises. That learning happens through repetition, not force. And it's one of the ways emotional self care becomes more reliable over time. There's one more process that becomes especially relevant when activation is high, and that's where attention is directed. Under stress, attention narrows. The nervous system becomes more focused on threat, loss, and what feels wrong. That narrowing happens automatically. It's part of how the system tries to protect itself. The problem is that when attention stays locked on threat, activation tends to stay elevated. Recovery slows, and the system has a harder time settling, even after the immediate stressor has passed. What helps here is not forcing positive thinking or minimizing difficulty. It's allowing attention to register more than one kind of information at the same time. That might include noticing that support is available, that you've handled something similar before, or that there is some capacity present, even alongside distress. This doesn't erase what's hard. It widens what the nervous system is taking in. When attention includes evidence of safety, support, or capability, regulatory systems have more to work with. Activation begins to settle sooner. Recovery becomes easier. This isn't about changing how you feel in the moment. It's about supporting how the system comes down after activation rises. That shift in attention plays a quiet but important role in making emotional self care more effective when activation is already high. As these processes are practiced over time, people often notice that their emotional lives begin to change in very practical ways. Activation still happens, stress still shows up, urges can still arise. What changes is how long those states last and how much they drive your behavior. Recovery from activation tends to happen more quickly. Instead of staying elevated for long periods, the nervous system settles sooner once support is available. Emotional escalation is less extreme. Reactions feel less consuming. Choice also becomes more available, not because you're trying harder, but because awareness and regulation are staying online more consistently when activation rises. There's more room to respond rather than react. These changes are usually subtle and gradual. They show up in ordinary moments. How long it takes to recover after a difficult interaction, how intense an urge feels, how quickly self criticism softens, and how much energy is left at the end of the day. This is what emotional self care looks like when it's functioning over time. Not dramatic or forced, but steady in its effects on daily experience. As we come toward the end of this course, I want to leave you with a practice that you can actually use when emotional activation is already high. This isn't a new technique, and it isn't something created just for this course. It's a well established practice that's been used for many years in therapeutic settings to work directly with emotional activation as it's happening. The practice is called RAIN. Many of you may already be familiar with it. What happens here is not memorizing the steps, but understanding how it functions when the nervous system is already activated, when emotions, urges, or reactions are moving quickly. RAIN works because it supports emotional processing without requiring activation to settle first. It gives the nervous system a way to stay engaged with experience rather than escalating it or cutting it off. I'm going to walk through it in a straightforward, practical way. R stands for recognize. The first step is recognizing what's happening in the moment. This might be recognizing an emotion, an urge, a physical sensation, or a familiar reaction pattern beginning to form. You might notice tightness in your chest, a surge of urgency, a pull toward a familiar response. The recognition is simple and factual. This is what is happening right now. There's no need to explain it or evaluate it. You are just bringing awareness to something that often runs automatically. The A stands for allow. Allowing means letting the experience be present without trying to push it away or rush through it. This doesn't mean liking it. It doesn't mean agreeing with it. It means not adding additional struggle on top of what's already happening. When activation is high, resistance often increases intensity. Allowing reduces the extra layer, which gives the nervous system more room to process what's already there. The I stands for investigate. Investigation here is gentle and curious. This might mean noticing where the experience is felt in your body. It might mean noticing what the emotion feels like as a physical experience. It might mean sensing what the reaction is trying to protect against. You're not trying to fix anything or come to a conclusion. You're staying oriented to the experience as it unfolds. The purpose of investigation is presence, not insight. And finally, the N stands for nurture. Nurturing means bringing steady, non judgmental presence to the experience. That might be through grounding attention in the body. It might be through a supportive internal tone. It might simply be staying with the experience without turning against yourself. This step helps the nervous system complete the activation cycle without escalating it further. And often something shifts here. The intensity changes slightly. the urgency loosens, the reaction stops building. That's not because you controlled it, it's because the nervous system was allowed to process without interruption. When rain is used this way, the result is not immediate calm. What usually happens is that the experience becomes more workable. There's more room inside of it. And from that place, choice becomes available again. Not perfect choice, not unlimited choice, but enough choice to respond rather than react. That's the value of this practice. As we come to the end of this course, I want to reflect on what we've been building together. Throughout this work, the focus has been on developing internal capacity, the ability to stay present with emotional experience as it unfolds. That capacity shapes how emotions move through the nervous system and how they stay active. Over time, people often notice subtle shifts. Emotional reactions still occur, but they don't gather the same momentum. Recovery happens much more quickly, and there's room to respond instead of being carried by reaction. What makes this work meaningful is that it doesn't rely on special circumstances. It shows up in everyday situations, small interactions, moments of stress, brief pauses where awareness stays engaged. That's where emotional self care actually lives. As you move forward, this capacity continues to develop through use. Each moment of presence continues to a different relationship with emotional experience over time. Thank you for spending this time with me, with the material, and engaging with it thoughtfully as you care for yourself.